Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. Leaders around the world have adopted the language of war to capture the scale of the threat posed by coronavirus. But are they deploying the right weaponry, not just to protect public health, but to prevent a worldwide economic depression? Well, my guest is Laurence Boone, Chief Economist at the Global Economic Forum, the OECD. Will we get the dramatic, coordinated emergency intervention needed to stave off economic disaster? Laurence Boone in Paris, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Of course, you are in Paris. Your own president, President Macron, talks about a war, his country and the world being engaged in a war against coronavirus. Do you see that actions are matching the words when it comes to trying to safeguard the world economy?
Well, there are actually three fronts on which we have to fight this battle. One is health, and the other is economics and financial and social. On health, I think there could be more cooperation with the WHO, because at the moment, whether it's about data collection, provision of supplies, equipment, and testing, then there seems to be a little lack of coordination. On economic and finance, we are actually seeing a lot happening. Many governments are putting in place measures to address their healthcare system, but also people to make sure that they can support people during this crisis, as well, and firms make sure that firms do not go under with the hardship that's going on at the moment.
But there is this question of urgency, because you talk about individuals, you talk about businesses. The fact is that on both levels, corporate and individual, people are running out of money. They are literally running out of money. And while leaders are now talking big in terms of their responses, is it happening quickly enough?
On economics and finance, on people's money, as you rightly put it, most countries have extended unemployment benefits. Some countries are even talking about writing checks to households who cannot have unemployment insurance. There may be some left, some people who are more vulnerable and still need more support, but I think a lot really is being done. And on firms, there's equivalently many measures. You have first tax and charges deferrals or suspension, VAT reduction in some countries, social contribution or taxes on wages being postponed, and also central banks making sure that banks have the liquidity which is necessary for firms to keep afloat. And the same with the credit that they have to repay. There's also deferral and suspension and mediation. So again, I think on this front, quite a lot is being done.
Well, we'll go through some of the detailed responses, the way in which governments are using fiscal policy in ways that we haven't seen since the financial crash of 2008, and in some cases going much further even than that. But before we go into the detail, just one point for you. You say, plenty's being done on the financial and economic front, but the markets are still in a state of panic. We see plunges of 5 or 6 or even up to 10% in markets across the world on a daily basis. Some people are saying that level of panic, that level of volatility is so damaging that there may be, in the short run, a case for suspending market operations for days, maybe even weeks. What do you think of that?
Regarding market suspension, as I'm sure you know, it happened once in the US. The stock market was closed for a week in the wake of 9/11. So we know this may happen. It's obviously not desirable because it's complicating matters a little. but there has been talks, and we know it has happened.
Would you favour it? I mean, you're a very experienced economist, and I just wonder whether at times you think that the way in which the markets work, and of course short sellers are at work in many of the major markets, maybe that actually exaggerates the amount of damage being done to corporate life.
Actually, central banks, as you know, have deployed also a lot of measures. And what we are observing is central banks are becoming, have been super efficient at targeting segments of the market that are not functioning properly because of this uncertainty we were describing. For example, you have the US yesterday, the US Fed really intervening on the deposit certificate side of the market, which is, as you know, funding firms in the short term. And that sort of alleviated and really corrected some of the distortion we were observing there. So I think for the time being, addressing this market distortion, temporary suspension when things are moving too fast is probably wise. And then we can consider tougher measures if things are not enough.
You're a global economic sort of research center and forum. Where do you see the biggest weaknesses and problems going forward? China appears, and let us not predict too much, but China appears to have some sort of significant control now over new cases of coronavirus, over the spread. Whereas there is great concern that in the United States, for example, partly because of the nature of the system there, the balance between federal and state agencies, the lack of a social safety net, the lack of a socialized healthcare service, there is a fear that the United States could become the biggest problem in the coronavirus crisis. What is your analysis?
You point the finger exactly on one of the key issues, which is that the way this is being addressed varies a lot depending on the region. It's very sequential, it's very staggered across time, and sometimes governments wait and little too long until they see increasing in cases before acting. So again, I think that's why it's super important that they start coordinating on what's the best approach, what's the best containment measure, what's the best about travel bans and borders.
So which countries, Laurence, are you most concerned about right now when you look at the nature of their response?
I think you rightly pointed out the countries that do not have usual safety net and reasonable automatic stabilizer, so the unemployment insurance system and so on, because they have to go an extra mile in doing that.
You are suggesting the United States has a systemic problem.
I am not suggesting that, because they have actually moved ahead very forcefully. As you know, they came out yesterday with very big numbers. They're even considering, which is what one should do when there is a restricted safety net, writing checks to people to make sure that they all receive something and can go through the crisis with some income.
Why do you think that we are not seeing the level of global coordination at leader level in this crisis that we saw, for example, after the financial crash of 2008 and the way in which the G20 leadership group responded? We're not seeing that this time. And if I quote to you the former UK Foreign Secretary David Miliband, he says, "I'm afraid it speaks to the age that we are living in. There is very little international coordination. Each country is doing its own thing, fighting for itself, and that heightens the danger."
We shouldn't be that negative. There is some coordination. The G7 has issued a very forceful communique, and that was not an easy thing in the circumstances. And that brings me to my second point.
I've got to stop you, Laurence, because you clearly are a natural-born optimist. But let us not forget, Donald Trump, just a couple of days ago, called this the Chinese virus. He closed flights from Europe without even telling the Europeans. You can hardly argue to me that we're seeing successful international coordination.
He said that before he finally moved to sign the G7 communique, so you may see there a glimpse of hope. But more to the point, I think you're right that this is also a sign of times. As you know, for the past 2 to 3 years, we have had trade tension, pressure on multilateralism, difficult international dialogue, and this is naturally reflecting today in the fact that they have to do an extra mile, and it's not as natural, quote unquote, as it was in 2008, 2009 to move together and to act in a coordinated manner. But you say I'm an optimist. The fact that we've seen something with the G7, I think, is a sign that this might be changing slightly in regard of the magnitude of the crisis we're getting across.
Okay, so let's talk magnitude, and let's not be optimists or pessimists, but realists. I am very mindful that just a few days ago, I believe it was March 2nd, you at the OECD issued your latest sort of global economic assessment, and you took on board the dangers presented by coronavirus, and you said, you know, if it intensifies and it's extensive across the world, it could cut global growth to roughly 1.5% this year. But even now, just these few weeks later, that looks absurdly unrealistic. Are you now prepared to tell me that you think there is going to be a global recession as a result of what we're seeing? And as Martin Wolf, the esteemed FT commentator, says, in all likelihood, a global depression.
If you think about this downside scenario, what do we have in there when we said it's going to cut global growth by half? We had the Northern Hemisphere, so all OECD countries, the US, Canada, and in the North, and some Asian Pacific countries, putting in place the same containment measures as what we've seen in China. So I think it depicts pretty well the situation we are in today.
but Laurence, that's not that. First of all, that's not happening. I mean, I'm speaking to you from the UK. People are not restricted in their travel by law. They are advised to do certain things and not do other things. But there isn't the draconian sort of imposition of controls that we've seen in other European countries. So it's a mixed bag. And in terms of that mixed bag, and let's not forget what you've already said about America, the idea that a recession can be avoided now looks completely unrealistic.
What we are doing at the OECD with all the economists that are being there is monitoring on the ground, day by day, what is happening. And what I mean by that is we're looking sector by sector. What's closed? What's working? How many people have stopped working? I'll give you an example. Tourism, globally, that's nearly 320 million jobs. It's nearly 10% of the workforce, and they're nearly all not working today. So it's true, there's a lot of uncertainty. We're trying to assess how things are going, but I think we have to start, really looking at what's happening in the real world and country by country, which is why what I've given you is a framework. But when we look more deeply into this, which is what we're doing now, then we'll see probably that, yes, there's a higher risk of going further down than what we've said so far.
What about that word depression, i.e. prolonged recession, some sort of prolonged economic slump? Some are saying, that this could be, post-Second World War, the most damaging period for the world economy that we have seen. Would you say that you're beginning to feel that yourself?
So it's definitely the biggest crisis and the most uncertain one as well that we've come across, because that's the one on which we have less control, right? It's a virus. It's not a liquidity
sure.
issue. So this effectively means that it could be a very, very big crisis. That being said, I think the compass for us should be to try and have scenarios depending on how the virus epidemic evolves. If we're confined to diverse extent for a couple of months and then we find a vaccine and a drug and it's gone, then you're going to accuse me again of erring on the optimistic side. But there are other scenarios, and it could be that the virus clearly goes away in the summer but comes back in the winter, or that we struggle to actually eradicate it until we find or just reduce it until we find a vaccine. And this opened the door to a variety of economic scenarios on which I don't think anybody today can have any certainty.
Right. What we do know, and you've already alluded to it, is that governments around the world are now pumping vast amounts of cash into their economies to bail out businesses, support and prop up businesses, and indeed to hand cash to individuals, whether it literally be the Americans planning to write a check to every individual American family, or whether it's Mr. Macron, the Scandinavians, offering extended sick pay and pay for those who've been laid off their work. There are all sorts of different ways of putting cash into the economy, but the bottom line is it's going to increase indebtedness. And I just wonder whether you believe at the end of all of this, whether we're talking about public state debt or individual debt, there is going to be a sort of accounting for this. There is going to be a profound debt problem at the end of all of this.
So it's true, the amount being injected in the economy are very large, and they're unprecedented, perhaps closer to what we have seen during war episode than a crisis. But I also think that it's necessary to prevent even bigger debt. But let me, if you don't mind, give you a sentence on this. What's happening at the moment is governments, policymakers are trying to do everything to buffer the shock, to prevent the dip or the economy going down too far. So what they're doing is keeping afloat, as if you wish, putting asleep part of the economic activity, compensating people for that, so that you can awake the economy when the virus is going and containment measures are going. And by doing that, we will recover more quickly, there will be bigger growth, and with very low interest rates, we should be able to tackle part of this debt issue. If, on the other hand, we were letting the economy run its course and closing down, firms going bankrupt and people getting out of money, then not only the recession or the crisis would be worse, but we would have even bigger debt issue at the end of this period.
Right. We've already said markets aren't convinced that even the emergency measures taken thus far are going to work, and there is a great deal of uncertainty. It just seems to me we're running out of economic levers. Interest rates have been reduced to virtually zero in the US and the UK and elsewhere. So monetary policy has run out of ammunition. We are pumping money into the world economy. As you've just said, it keeps people afloat. It sort of anesthetizes the problem to a certain extent. But it isn't really working. And the problem is that in the long run, we are sowing the seeds for perhaps an inflationary crisis, for an economy that is becoming deeply dysfunctional.
So it's certainly, we have to hope that this doesn't last for 2 years and for too long in any case. But there's one thing I should say. The first one is in terms of monetary policy. As you know, central bank's balance sheet is illimited, right? There's always a way for them to pump liquidity into an economy, and the way they do it differs from one country to another because they have different levels. They're there. I think that's something to keep in mind. They've shown before that they can do whatever is necessary in the crisis, and I think they will show it again.
Let's think about the economic landscape as and when this crisis is over, or at least is less damaging than right now. What have we learned, particularly about globalization? Because it seems to me globalization as we've known it through the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, it doesn't look sustainable going forward.
When we will get out of this, there will be definitely a large amount of thinking and revision of the way the world has been functioning economically over the past decades. Because what you rightly point out is this crisis has underlined two things. First, we have to review the way healthcare system operates and how we cooperate globally to ensure that these types of pandemic may be contained much more quickly. But more than that, it also really put under the spotlight the way that our economies function, with the amount of traveling we do, and with the way that global value chain or the production is functioning. I'm quite confident that some companies will reflect on where they source their components and how does that affect their production, and if it's too restricted to one country, or they should diversify the sources of the component and input they have in their production chain.
Right, but I mean, the mindset of so many countries and leaders in the world today is not that of cooperation. It is of competition, of rivalry, of protecting what they have against what others have. And that seems to me to run entirely counter to the idea that in the future we can approach these sort of potential problems from pandemics and health challenges in a cooperative way. We aren't being cooperative. Just look at the fact Donald Trump tried to buy the intellectual property of the German company that is one of the most prominent in the search for a vaccine. He wanted exclusive rights to use that vaccine for Americans. That's the mentality that we have in our world today.
Well, he's not getting it right, and everybody needs the vaccine, and anybody needs to fight together this virus. On the economic and financial side, I think it will be more about risk diversification and security. So I think you're right. It will lead us to look at things in a different way, but that doesn't necessarily mean protectionism, because what that shows as well is we need to ensure that there is food supply going through borders, that there is mask being set going through border, that masks are not produced in one country only, but that they can be produced in different countries. So in some ways, yes, production chain will likely be shorter, but this is also a lesson in how, when we are not super organized about managing a global common issue, and health is one, then we run into very big and perhaps more prolonged than necessary trouble.
One final thought for you, and you could argue it's perhaps slightly more positive. There is an extraordinary thing that has happened since this coronavirus really hit the world economy. We have seen a phenomenal improvement, for example, in the air quality that has been recorded in China. We've even seen fish coming back into the canals in Venice. It is quite clear that as economic output and activity has stalled across the world, environmental conditions, including emissions, have actually improved in terms of what the world needs for its climate change challenge. Let me quote you Glenn Peters, the research director for the International Climate and Environment Research Centre in Oslo. He said, "We must find ways when we rebuild the economy of learning some of these lessons. We mustn't simply restore emissions." Do you think we will learn that lesson?
I think the shock is so big that we will learn a lot of lessons, and you're very right to point at climate, in part because the reduced biodiversity with climate change may be also responsible for how fast the virus may have spread, or how virus may emerge. From what I understand, I'm not a health expert, but climate is also a common good. And it will have demonstrated how things can change rapidly when we do things differently. The travel will also change the way businesses do things, because we're all teleworking, or a lot of us are teleworking now, reduced our travel, and yet a lot of activity, bar the containment, of course, can still go on. So yes, I think the shock has been very big, is being very big. And this will lead us to really rethink some of our economic model.
A very interesting thought to end on. Laurence Boone, I thank you very much for joining me on Hard Talk.